Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases to ever emerge from America's heartland. This is the story of Robert Berdella, a man whose ordinary facade concealed unimaginable horrors. What you're about to hear involves graphic descriptions of violence and torture. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Picture Kansas City in the 1980s, a bustling Midwest metropolis where neighbors knew each other, where small businesses thrived in close-knit communities. On Charlotte Street, in the Hyde Park neighborhood, stood an unremarkable house at number 4315. Its owner appeared to be just another local merchant, perhaps a bit eccentric, but harmless enough. Robert Berdella was the kind of person who blended into the background. "I was a person who kept to myself," he would later tell investigators. To most who encountered him, he seemed like nothing more than a quiet, strange, but ultimately non-threatening figure. He ran a small business, kept his property reasonably maintained, and didn't cause obvious trouble. In a city of hundreds of thousands, he was invisible, exactly as he intended. But beneath this carefully constructed veneer of normalcy lurked something far more sinister. As one police officer would later reflect, people never really know what someone is capable of. These words would prove prophetic when the truth about Robert Berdella finally emerged. What made Berdella particularly dangerous wasn't just his ability to appear normal. It was his intelligence and his methodical nature. This wasn't a man who acted on impulse or in fits of rage. Scholars who later studied his case noted that Berdella had researched older crime cases, studying them with the dedication of an academic. He was learning, preparing, perfecting his methods. The neighborhood around Charlotte Street was busy enough that people came and went without much notice, yet intimate enough that Berdella could operate from his home base. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of urban life. Young men who lived on the margins of society could disappear without immediate alarm bells ringing. "I never meant for anyone to die," Berdella would later claim to investigators. But the evidence would tell a very different story, one of calculated cruelty and methodical murder that spanned years. This was no accident or crime of passion. This was systematic predation, carried out behind the walls of an ordinary-looking house in broad daylight. In the 1970s, after leaving art school, Berdella began building what appeared to be a legitimate life in Kansas City. He had always been drawn to the unusual, the macabre, the objects that most people would find unsettling. This fascination eventually evolved into a business opportunity that would serve as both a source of income and, unknowingly to his customers, a reflection of his darkest impulses. By 1982, Berdella had rented a booth in the Westport Flea Market, an eclectic venue that catered to those seeking the unusual and antique. He called his venture Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, and the name was more fitting than customers could have imagined. The shop was unlike anything else in the market. While other vendors sold typical antiques, collectibles, and crafts, Berdella's booth attracted attention for all the wrong reasons. Customers remembered seeing human skulls prominently displayed in the shop window, or at least objects that appeared to be skulls. There were shrunken heads, or replicas thereof, occult books, primitive art from distant lands, unusual jewelry, knives, and swords. One customer would later recall asking Berdella about witchcraft jewelry and bone-based items. The inventory seemed designed to unnerve, to attract those drawn to the macabre, while simultaneously repelling the faint of heart. It was a perfect cover for someone whose private interests ran much darker than even his most unusual merchandise. What customers didn't realize was how the shop's inventory mirrored the contents of Berdella's home. The skulls in his display cases weren't just replicas or legally obtained medical specimens. At least some of them weren't. The books on witchcraft and the occult weren't just for show. The knives weren't merely collector's items. By the early 1980s, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar had become more than a side business for Berdella. It was his primary occupation, allowing him to shift away from cooking jobs and focus on this venture that so perfectly matched his interests. In the alternative and underground community of Kansas City, particularly around Westport, he became a known figure, eccentric certainly, but tolerated as just another strange collector type. The shop served multiple purposes in Berdella's twisted world. It provided income. It allowed him to indulge his fascination with death and the occult openly. And it may have even provided him with items that served more sinister purposes. When police eventually searched his home, they found an extensive library on witchcraft and occult subjects, restraint devices, and other materials that bore disturbing similarities to some of his shop's merchandise. Looking back, the customers who browsed Bob's Bizarre Bazaar had been getting a glimpse into the mind of a killer. The skulls in the window weren't just curious antiques, they were trophies. The occult books weren't just for atmosphere, they were reference materials. The shop was in many ways Robert Berdella's first confession, hidden in plain sight. Between 1984 and 1987, Robert Berdella embarked on a killing spree that would claim at least 6 lives. But his choice of victims wasn't random. It was calculated, strategic, and coldly logical. Understanding who he targeted reveals the methodical mind of a predator who had studied his craft. Berdella's victims were all young men, but more specifically, they were men living on the margins of society. They were homeless or transient, struggling with addiction, involved in sex work, or simply living unstable lives without strong social connections. These weren't accidental choices. They were carefully selected targets. His first known victim was Jerry Howell, just 19 years old when he disappeared in July 1984. Jerry was the son of a nearby flea market vendor, but his fragile social ties meant his disappearance went largely unnoticed. This established a pattern that Berdella would follow throughout his killing spree. Robert Sheldon came next in 1985, a young man who had actually sought out Berdella for shelter. Then there was Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson, each representing the same demographic, vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be immediately missed. Berdella's hunting strategy was as calculated as his victim selection. He didn't prowl dark alleys or use violence to capture his prey. Instead, he offered help, food, shelter, drugs, or simply a place to stay. This approach was devastatingly effective because it appealed directly to the most pressing needs of his chosen victims. For young men living on the streets, the offer of a warm bed, a hot meal, or temporary safety was irresistible. Berdella understood this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. He positioned himself as a savior, a good Samaritan offering assistance to those whom society had largely abandoned. The genius of this approach was that it required his victims to come to him willingly. There was no struggle on the street, no witnesses to an abduction, no evidence of coercion. His victims walked into his trap believing they were being rescued. Once inside his home at 4315 Charlotte Street, the trap was sprung. The promised sanctuary became a prison, the helpful merchant became a monster, and the temporary shelter became a place where these young men would spend their final, agonizing days. The selection of marginalized victims served multiple purposes for Berdella. First, it reduced his risk of detection. These men often had no family watching for them, no stable address where their absence would be noticed, no regular jobs or appointments they were expected to attend. Second, their vulnerability made them easier to control once captured. They had no resources, no support system to call upon, nowhere else to go. But perhaps most chillingly, Berdella seems to have understood that society's indifference to these men would work in his favor. Young men involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, or living on the streets were often viewed as disposable by authorities and the general public. Their disappearances might be noted, but they were unlikely to trigger intensive investigations. What happened inside 4315 Charlotte Street defies comprehension. When police finally entered that house in April 1988, they discovered evidence of systematic torture, sexual abuse, and murder that had been ongoing for years. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the methodical way Berdella had documented every moment of his victim's suffering. The second-floor bedroom had been converted into what can only be described as a torture chamber. Bedposts were wired with electrical equipment capable of delivering up to 7,700 volts. Burned and charred ropes were attached to various points around the bed. The room contained restraints, injection equipment, and other devices that had been used to inflict unimaginable pain. But it was the discovery of Berdella's documentation that truly revealed the depths of his depravity. Police found over 200 Polaroid photographs showing multiple men in various states of torture, bondage, and death. These weren't spontaneous snapshots. They were systematic documentation of prolonged suffering. More disturbing still was the discovery of what investigators called torture logs, detailed written records that Berdella had maintained throughout his killing spree. These logs contained an alarming level of detail that reflected his compulsion for control and his need to relive his crimes. In these records, Berdella meticulously documented every aspect of his victim's captivity. He recorded the exact words his victims spoke when they regained consciousness to find themselves bound and helpless. He noted the precise amounts and times of drug injections, substances like diazepam and ispromazine that he used to keep his victims compliant but conscious. The logs revealed that Berdella's torture sessions could last for weeks. His victims endured electrical shocks applied to their nipples, shoulders, and testicles. They suffered through what he called acupuncture, the insertion of hypodermic needles into their necks and genitals. They were drugged, photographed, sexually assaulted, and subjected to torments that seemed designed more to prolong suffering than to kill quickly. Berdella even documented his victims' deaths with clinical detachment. When James Ferris finally died after 27 hours of torture, Berdella noted his victim's inability to sit up, recorded very delayed breathing, and then marked his death with the chef's term 86, meaning throw it out or stop the project. For Mark Wallace, Berdella logged the time of death as 7 p.m. on June 23rd, attributing his demise to a combination of drugs, a gag, and lack of oxygen. The casual, matter-of-fact tone of these entries reveals a mind completely disconnected from human empathy. These weren't crimes of passion or even traditional serial killings. They were prolonged torture sessions designed to give Berdella complete control over another human being. His logs sometimes included ideas for future projects, revealing that he was constantly thinking about new ways to torment his captives. The documentation served multiple purposes for Berdella. It allowed him to relive his crimes long after they were committed. It fed his compulsion for control and dominance, and it provided him with a reference guide for perfecting his techniques with future victims. When Berdella finally confessed to authorities, his statement ran to 720 pages, a horrifying inventory of systematic cruelty that stands as one of the most detailed confessions in criminal history. Every page revealed new depths of depravity, new evidence of the methodical mind that had planned and executed these crimes over years. March 29, 1988, started like any other day for Robert Berdella. He was planning to add another victim to his collection, another young man who would disappear into the torture chamber of his Charlotte Street home. He had no way of knowing that this victim would be different, that Christopher Bryson would become the key to unraveling everything Berdella had built. Bryson was a 22-year-old male prostitute when Berdella approached him with what seemed like a routine transaction: payment for sex. It was the same lure Berdella had used before, the promise of easy money that would draw his victim willingly into his trap. Bryson had no reason to suspect that accepting this offer would nearly cost him his life. Once inside the house on Charlotte Street, Bryson was led upstairs under the pretense of avoiding Berdella's dogs. It was there that the facade dropped completely. Without warning, Berdella struck Bryson on the head with an iron bar, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, Bryson found himself in a nightmare that had already claimed 6 lives. He was naked, bound spread-eagle to the bed, completely immobilized. Berdella had injected him with sedatives, but not enough to render him unconscious. He needed his victims awake to truly savor their fear and suffering. Over the next several days, Bryson endured the same horrors that had killed the men who came before him. He was repeatedly raped and tortured. His eyes were swabbed with ammonia, causing excruciating pain and temporary blindness. He was drugged with unknown substances, photographed in various states of bondage, and subjected to electrical torture. The walls and posts around the bed bore the charred remains of ropes that had restrained previous victims. Berdella made sure Bryson understood his situation completely. He told him directly that escape meant death, referencing past victims who had made mistakes. The message was clear. Others had tried to resist, and they were dead. Bryson was meant to understand that his survival depended entirely on Berdella's whims. For days, Bryson endured agony that had proven fatal to 6 previous victims. His throat and vocal cords were damaged to prevent him from screaming. He was chained, drugged, and helpless, believing with each passing hour that he would join the parade of young men who had died in that room. But on April 2nd, 1988, while Berdella was away at work, Bryson found his chance. In what would prove to be a fatal oversight on Berdella's part, a box of matches had been left within reach. Bryson had managed to loosen his right wrist just enough to grab those matches, and he used them to burn through the restraining ropes. The escape itself was harrowing. Bryson climbed to a second-floor window and jumped, breaking his foot in the landing. But pain and injury couldn't stop him. He ran through the neighborhood wearing nothing but a dog collar, his body bearing the clear evidence of prolonged torture and abuse. A meter reader witnessed the escape and alerted others. Bryson reached a neighbor's house and collapsed, his appearance so shocking that there could be no question about what had happened to him. He was bruised, bleeding, with swollen eyes and scars around his wrists and mouth. His broken foot was the least of his injuries. When police and paramedics arrived, they found a young man who had literally escaped from hell. Once Bryson was stable enough to speak, his testimony painted a horrifying picture of systematic torture and imprisonment. He described being abducted, bound, drugged, photographed, and repeatedly assaulted. He spoke of electrical devices, injection equipment, and the clear threat that he would be killed if he tried to escape. But most importantly for investigators, Bryson could tell them exactly where these crimes had taken place. He could describe the layout of the torture chamber, the equipment used, even details about his captor's routine. For the first time in 4 years, someone had survived Robert Berdella's House of Horrors and could tell the world what was happening behind those ordinary-looking walls. That same day, police obtained a search warrant for 4,315 Charlotte Street. What they found there confirmed every detail of Bryson's account and revealed evidence of crimes far worse than they had initially imagined. The house that had appeared so normal from the outside was revealed to be the site of systematic torture and murder spanning several years. Berdella's carefully constructed life was about to collapse completely, brought down by one victim's determination to survive and one careless moment that left a box of matches within reach. After years of perfect control, one small oversight would prove to be his downfall. When police executed their search warrant on April 2, 1988, they entered a crime scene unlike anything in Kansas City's history. The evidence they discovered in Robert Berdella's home was so overwhelming and disturbing that it left hardened investigators shaken. As one officer later said, "It was the most disturbing scene I have ever walked into." The second-floor bedroom told the story of systematic torture in horrifying detail. Bedposts were wired with electrical transformers, burned ropes still attached to various anchor points. But it was the photographic evidence that truly revealed the scope of Berdella's crimes. Investigators recovered 334 Polaroid photographs and 34 snapshot prints showing multiple men in various states of torture, bondage, and death. The physical evidence was equally damning. Human skulls were found both in the house and buried in the backyard. Vertebrae bearing hacksaw marks provided clear evidence of dismemberment. One skull was later identified as belonging to Robert Sheldon, one of the missing men who could now be confirmed as a murder victim. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Berdella's torture logs, detailed records he had kept for each victim. These weren't just simple notes, but comprehensive documentation of every aspect of his crimes. The logs revealed a mind obsessed with control and documentation, someone who needed to record every moment of his victim's suffering. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, along with Christopher Bryson's detailed testimony about his own captivity and torture, authorities had an ironclad case. Berdella was arrested on April 2nd, initially charged with sexual assault, sodomy, and unlawful restraint relating to Bryson's case. Bail was set at $500,000. As investigators continued to process the evidence, the true scope of the crimes became clear. On July 22, 1988, a grand jury indicted Berdella for the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson, whose severed head had been found buried in the backyard. With clear evidence linking him to multiple murders, Berdella's bail was revoked entirely. Prosecutors had enough evidence to seek the death penalty, and in Missouri in 1988, Berdella would have been a prime candidate for execution. However, they offered him a deal that would spare his life in exchange for a full confession to all his crimes. For prosecutors, this bargain served multiple purposes. It would provide closure to the families of missing men, reveal the full scope of his crimes, and eliminate the time and expense of a lengthy trial. Between December 13th and 15th, 1988, Robert Berdella provided that confession. Over the course of 3 days, he admitted to abducting, torturing, raping, and murdering 6 young men between 1984 and 1987. His confession ran to 720 pages of disturbing detail, providing investigators with a horrifying roadmap of his 4-year killing spree. Berdella confessed to the murders of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson. He described how he had lured each man to his house, the torture he had inflicted, and the methodical way he had disposed of their bodies. Most remains were dismembered and placed in trash bags, then left for garbage collection, a detail that haunted investigators who realized how close the evidence had come to being lost forever. On December 19, 1988, Berdella formally pleaded guilty in court. He accepted 1 count of first-degree murder for Sheldon's death and 4 counts of second-degree murder for the other victims, plus charges related to Larry Pearson's murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During his court appearances, Berdella showed little emotion. He spoke in a flat, detached tone that chilled observers. "I accept responsibility, but I did not set out to become a killer," he told the court. Few believed this statement, given the extensive documentation and planning that his crimes had clearly required. Berdella was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, where he began serving his multiple life sentences. Prison officials noted that he was generally a model prisoner, causing few problems and keeping largely to himself, much as he had appeared to be in his Kansas City neighborhood. On October 8, 1992, just 4 years into his sentence, Robert Berdella died of a heart attack at age 43. He had complained of chest pains and was taken to a hospital, where doctors confirmed that the cause of death was cardiac arrest. His death brought mixed reactions. Some felt it prevented years of appeals and legal proceedings, while others believed he should have lived to serve his full sentence. The house at 4315 Charlotte Street was eventually demolished. No one wanted to live there, and the city had no desire for the building to become a macabre tourist attraction. The lot where it stood serves as a quiet reminder of the horrors that once took place there. The Robert Berdella case reshaped Kansas City, exposing how missing person reports, especially those involving marginalized young men, were too easily overlooked. His ability to hide a sadistic double life behind the mask of a friendly neighborhood shopkeeper still haunts investigators and criminal psychologists today. And even now, some believe there are details in his meticulous logs that hint at secrets never fully uncovered. But what if there's more to this story than what was found inside that house on Charlotte Street? To hear the full account, and the parts that still raise unanswered questions, download the Skoob app now to get access to the complete story.